So Ginny, I gave and I took away. So I did you the favor of not having to read all the crazy introductory stuff in the psalm or the selahs, but then I forgot to tell you that in the middle of the week I changed the middle hymn, so she still had an old bulletin, so that's on me. So, we've kind of, to the somewhat chagrin of the people doing the small groups, in order to be able to preach on these each week and make them match up with things going on in the church, we've gone somewhat out of order. So we did 1, 3, 4, now we're doing 2, and then we'll do 5. And part 2 is labeled in the book, Crime, Race, Terrorism, and Politics. What could possibly go wrong? So, in order to try to figure out how to distill all of that into a preachable topic, we've done what is on the screen in front of you, Disarming the Weapon of Fear. So, one of the observations Adam Hamilton makes in the book is that among Jesus' disciples is represented the full spectrum of political ideologies from first century Palestine. Now, we don't obviously know the politics of all of the disciples. In fact, we really only know 2. But that's enough to know that there's a wide diversity in the group. One of the disciples, Simon, not Simon Peter, but the other Simon. I got to call Larry Royster last night. I said, "Hello, Larry, it's the other Larry." This is actually the first church where we've had multiple Larrys. Hello, Larry Lieb, my other brother in Larryness, so I feel right at home. So Simon, often called Simon the Zealot, is one of the disciples. Another disciple, Matthew, sometimes called Levi, was, of course, a tax collector. Kind of have opposite ends of the political ideology. You have the zealots who wanted to get rid of the Romans, and you had the tax collectors who were actually collaborating with the Romans. So there we've got our two Simon and Matthew, one the zealot, one the tax collector. And as I said, go ahead and click the next one up. The zealots were very much, I was going to include that in there. Never mind. I told you that the zealots are anti-Rome and the tax collectors are collaborating with Rome. Yeah, so go ahead and do the other one. So the zealots were very much about individual liberty. They wanted to be free from tyranny. The tax collectors on the other side, they could see where collecting taxes for Rome was going for the general welfare. It paid for the aqueducts and for sanitation and for education. For any of you who ever watched Monty Python's The Life of Brian, I recommend it if you're okay with something just a little bit on the irreverent but fun side. There's a sequence where somebody says, "Well, what did the Romans ever do for us?" And then somebody says, "Sanitation." Says, "All right, well, other than sanitation, what have the Romans ever done for us?" "Oh, the aqueducts." "All right, well, the Senate," and they go through this whole litany of things that are good about the Roman Empire. And of course, the roads. The roads have to be in there. So you have individual liberty, freedom from Rome on the one side, and their tyranny, the general welfare that they provide on the other hand with infrastructure and law and order and all those other sorts of things. On the extreme end for each one, the zealots end up advocating for insurrection. They want to overthrow the government entirely. On the extreme end with the tax collectors, they are so in deep that they're completely collaborating with the Romans, even if it's to the detriment of their own people. Many of the tax collectors begin to take more than their fair share. They start to overcharge so that they can personally benefit, and they take advantage of Roman power for their own selfish reasons. Collaboration. The one thing that they have in common is that they are both violent. The zealots advocating for violent revolution against the state, the tax collectors perfectly good with violent enforcement of the state. So you can see a pretty wide divergence of views here amongst these people. And yet both of these two, Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector, are both disciples of Jesus. That crazy Jesus. Somehow, even with this huge divergence, Jesus manages to lead and teach both disciples. Part of Jesus' strategy seems to be a refusal to place Rome at the center of his teaching and to maintain focus always on God's kingdom. God's kingdom surely had inherent critiques of Rome and called for allegiance to the kingdom and not to Rome. Allegiance to Rome in the early church and Roman patriotism would be considered idolatrous, and many Christians chose martyrdom rather than allowing both Caesar and Christ to share a place on the throne of their hearts. God and empire was an abominable incongruity. At the same time, there was a recognition of Roman reality in a fallen world. When asked if it was lawful as a Jew to pay taxes to Rome, Jesus responded, "Show me the coin used for the tax. Whose head is this? Whose title appears there?" And when his interrogators acknowledged the image and the title were of Caesar, Jesus responded, "Therefore give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." The Bible as a whole is pretty ambivalent towards Rome. On the one hand, it is the Roman citizenship of Paul and the well-connected network of Roman cities and settlements throughout the Mediterranean world that allowed for the exponential spread of Christian faith in those first 2 or 3 decades following Jesus' ministry. On the other hand, in other portions of Scripture, especially the book of Revelation, Rome is envisioned as the new Babylon, the arch-enemy of the church, the murderous persecutor of the saints whose power must eventually fall to make way for a new world under God's reign. Even in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus sneaks in a clever little piece. You might remember the part where he says, "If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile." We talk about, second mile giving, or we kind of domesticate that. What he's really referring to is a practice by the Romans. A Roman soldier could impress somebody in an occupied land to carry the soldier's pack for him for up to 1 mile. There were mile markers on the road. But after 1 mile, you weren't supposed to be able to let that person do that anymore. You had to take it back. So if you really wanted to get a Roman soldier into trouble, you would just keep his pack and go the 2nd mile. It was a kind of clever way to resist a practice that was unjust. So while zealots were adamantly anti-Rome and tax collectors were unabashedly pro-Rome, Jesus was neither and both, all at the same time. And Jesus could be viewed at times as being both a proponent of individual liberty, certainly individual liberation, and of humanity's general welfare, our collective well-being. Undoubtedly, Jesus' acts of healing were acts of liberation, and his view on the Sabbath as being made for us rather than we for it, well, that was a liberating notion. On the other hand, his acts of healing also liberated entire groups of people, demonstrating God's acceptance of those the world considered sinful or unclean: eunuchs, lepers, menstruating women, the blind, the deaf, the lame, Samaritans, soldiers, even thieves. And when crowds of thousands followed him, hungering for his words, he also fed them bread, the loaves and the fish with baskets full to spare. And Jesus challenged both zealots and tax collectors with their misguided faith in military power, coercion, and violence. Those who live by the sword, he warned, will die by the sword. Jesus refused to become an earthly king, forsook legions of angels to champion his defense, and undermined the powers of violence and death through resistance and resurrection. Simon and Matthew, had they stood outside of the circle of Jesus' discipleship, likely would have disdained one another, perhaps even feared each other. But within the circle, united in Jesus, even they could operate on the same page. So what of Jesus' example are we able to appropriate and imitate? Yeah, we're not Jesus, I get that, right? And yes, there are things that Jesus was and is uniquely able to do which we cannot, but he didn't teach his disciples in vain. He doesn't leave his words for us in vain. God has given us, through him and through the Spirit, agency to follow in Jesus' footsteps, no matter how imperfectly. Perhaps that is what he meant, that we're to daily take up our cross and follow him. One thing that Jesus did, which we can continue to do if we put our minds and hearts to it, is he refused to use the language of the culture. He always used the language of the kingdom. So American culture, since that's our culture, if I were preaching someplace else, I'd say United Kingdom culture or whatever, but we're preaching here, versus kingdom faith. American culture, as we well know, most often speaks in the language of rights. What do I have the right to do? What do I have the right to be free from? It's me, me, me. Kingdom faith speaks in the language of responsibilities. I don't know if they still teach driver's ed the same way they did when I was taking it, but I remember that we were always told the right of way is never taken, it's always yielded. It's not that I have the right to go through this intersection. It's that person coming the other way has the responsibility of letting me go through that intersection. Rights versus responsibilities. Our culture tends to talk about freedom being freedom from others in order to do for self. In kingdom faith, freedom is about being free from our own selfish impulses and desires in order to do for others. That's a whole different understanding of freedom, isn't it? That was what was behind the monk's discipline. That's what's behind every spiritual discipline, is to forsake those things that are just self-absorption and ourselves in order to turn our minds toward God and toward service of other people. In the culture, our language talks most often about security and safety. In kingdom faith, the language is about risk and sacrifice. So often we, like Jesus says in John's gospel, we cling to life so hard that we lose it. And yet those who are willing to give of their life in this world will keep it abundantly and for eternity. We are so concerned about safety and security in terms of everything from standing our ground and defending what's mine to being so caught up in my own little academic bubble that I don't want to hear the voices of other people who would challenge me. Right? It doesn't matter which side of the spectrum you're on. We all speak in the language of safety and security and hunkering in instead of being willing to risk. The language of culture tells us that power is coercion. In kingdom faith, power is love. And nowhere do we see that more than in the life of Jesus Christ. Oh, sure, we have faith in coercion because it looks like it works right away, right? Think about that little kid that is upset with his brother, and he says, "Quit it!" Bam! And it seems to stop for the moment until it comes back over and over and over again. Until, if good parenting has happened, children learn how to love each other, and that conflict goes away. The language of culture values wealth. Not just wealth for having wealth, but even ascribing moral value to wealth, as though the more you have, the more virtuous you must have been, the harder you must have worked, and the less you have, full of vice you must have been. You must have goofed up. But kingdom faith values wisdom. Wisdom that is more than knowledge, but is experience that builds up over time, where we get to know each other and see past surface things like wealth and status to at least begin to do what God does in judging the heart. Lastly, culture, especially our culture, really teaches us about self-reliance and control. But we know from life's experience that control is an elusive thing. And the older we get, the more we realize how little control we really have. Kingdom faith teaches other reliance, reliance upon God and reliance upon each other, because it teaches humility, that we don't have all control, all power. You stack all these things up, it's no wonder then, is it, that so often in our culture we're taught to vote our fears instead of to live our hopes. No. Fears. There are a lot of fears running around right now. A number of fears that frame our rather fraught conversations around this week's Supreme Court decision. Yeah, I'm going there. I'm trusting that you know I love you and I know you love me, and that you understand when you walk through the barnyard, you're bound to step in it sometimes. But some things are worth stepping in it if it means us talking about important things. The fears stemming from this decision include medical procedures safeguarding the health of the mother becoming unavailable, criminalized, or stigmatized, putting the lives of women at risk. The fears include horrible scenarios playing out of children born from rape of young girls or incest, or of children carried to term only to be stillborn, or birthed into short-lived lives of frequent and ultimately futile surgeries. Prior to this decision, there were also fears under Roe v. Wade. Those fears included abortion being abused as a frequent means of birth control, rather than as a solution for difficult life versus life dilemmas. And for some, there was the fear that abortion could even be used for gender selection or other eugenic purposes. And beyond abortion, there are fears that this decision could provoke the overturning of other due process cases, leading to the reinstatement of laws forbidding homosexuality or the overturning of same-sex marriage. There is plenty of fear to go around. And the unfortunate thing is that even in the church, we have become so enmeshed in the language of culture instead of in the language of Christ that many of you, as I listed these fears, these concerns, you began glomming onto some and minimizing others, because our fears have become weaponized. Sometimes it's been done by well-meaning activists, but other times it's been done by organizations trying to raise money or by politicians whipping our votes. I'm going to read to you out of the Book of Discipline. There's a section in the United Methodist Book of Discipline that's called the Social Principles. Some of you are aware of it, others of you, maybe this is the first time you've heard of it. We don't operate like the Catholic Church where the Pope lays it out and this is what you have to believe or you're done. The social principles are very much deliberative conversation kinds of things that at General Conference people try to pray and discern and come up with, generally speaking, where we are at some given time. And you can tell even in the midst of the language of it, the amount of wrestling that has gone on in this statement. But I want to read it to you, the section that is on abortion. The beginning of life and the ending of life are the God-given boundaries of human existence. While individuals have always had some degree of control over when they would die, they now have the awesome power to determine when and even whether new individuals will be born. Our belief in the sanctity of unborn human life makes us reluctant to approve abortion, but we are equally bound to respect the sacredness of the life and well-being of the mother and the unborn child. We recognize tragic conflicts of life with life that may justify abortion, and in such cases we support the legal option of abortion under proper medical procedures by certified medical providers. We support parental, guardian, and other responsible adult notification and consent before abortions can be performed on girls who have not yet reached the age of legal adulthood. We cannot affirm abortion as an acceptable means of birth control, and we unconditionally reject it as a means of gender selection or eugenics. We oppose the use of late-term abortion, known as dilation and extraction, and call for the end of this practice, except when the physical life of the mother is in danger and no other medical procedure is available, or in the case of severe fetal anomalies incompatible with life. This procedure shall be performed only by certified medical providers. Before providing their services, abortion providers should be required to offer women the option of anesthesia. We call all Christians to a searching and prayerful inquiry into the sorts of conditions that may cause them to consider abortion. We entrust God to provide guidance, wisdom, and discernments to those facing an unintended pregnancy. The church shall offer ministries to reduce unintended pregnancies. We commit our church to continue to providing nurturing ministry to those who terminate a pregnancy, to those in the midst of a crisis pregnancy, and to those who give birth. We mourn and are committed to promoting the diminishment of high abortion rates. The church shall encourage ministries to reduce unintended pregnancies, such as comprehensive, age-appropriate sexuality education, advocacy in regard to contraception, and support of initiatives that enhance the quality of life for all women and girls around the globe. Young adult women disproportionately face situations in which they feel that they have no choice due to financial, educational, relational, or other circumstances beyond their control. The church and its local congregations and campus ministries should be in the forefront of supporting existing ministries and developing new ministries that help such women in their communities. They should also support those crisis pregnancy centers and pregnancy resource centers that compassionately help women explore all options related to unplanned pregnancy. We particularly encourage the church, the government, and social service agencies to support and facilitate the option of adoption. We affirm and encourage the church to assist the ministry of crisis pregnancy centers and pregnancy resource centers that compassionately help women find feasible alternatives to abortion. And it ends with this. Governmental laws and regulations do not provide all the guidance required by the informed Christian conscience. Therefore, a decision concerning abortion should be made only after thoughtful and prayerful consideration by the parties involved, with medical, family, pastoral, and other appropriate counsel. You can hear the struggle in there, can't you? The wrestling, the discernment, listening to all the fears and all the concerns and trying to make a place, and it's not a perfect statement by any stretch. There are places that probably make different people feel uncomfortable in different ways. For those who are zealots or tax collectors, firmly ensconced on one side or the other, firmly invested in one political tribe, such a statement of wrestling perhaps feels like a betrayal of clarity, or an unwelcome introduction of shades of gray into a moral universe of black and white. But ultimately, it isn't just gray for which we are advocating. It is grace. Let me say that again. It isn't gray for which we are advocating. It is grace. Now, concurrent with the United Methodist position, I personally, Larry, agree that in order to allow for grace, in order to acknowledge the very real conflicts of life with life that can come with pregnancy, abortion ought not be illegal. But I am extremely uncomfortable with the rhetoric that frames the abortion issue only as a matter of reproductive rights, without any recognizable regard for or responsibility toward the life or potential life in the womb. I can't talk about it like it's just health care. And likewise, I cannot countenance language that only advocates for the right to life of the unborn child with little to no regard for or responsibility acknowledged toward the life and well-being of the mother. You see, this cultural language of rights is thoroughly inadequate to the task of living compassionate, Christ-like lives of faith. The cultural language of rights is thoroughly inadequate to the task of living compassionate, Christ-like lives. We must use the kingdom language of responsibility to one another. So where do we go from here? Well, certainly, as the church, we should put our money and our missional muscle into providing for women, children, and families. We should have always been doing this, exercising our Christian responsibility to the least of these, to those most in need. And we must, especially in this age where fear is so weaponized, work to disarm it as a weapon in our midst. We must pledge ourselves not to being a zealot or a tax collector, but to living fully in the circle of Christ's discipleship. And then we will surely be able to say that God is our strength, our firm foundation. And though the nations rage and the kingdoms totter, and all seems to fall and fail around us, we can live lives of faith with courage and with hope, unafraid. Amen.